Good morning, guys. This has been a difficult pandemic. I gotta say, I know it has been difficult for each and every one of us, and you guys have been through a lot. You've been through a lot of new things that you had to learn, a lot of new things that you had to deal with socially, emotionally, dealing with your families, dealing with school. And I want to say I'm really proud of you for making it this far. You're still strong and proud and brave, and I'm amazed by all that you're doing. As we get closer and closer to in-person instruction, I want to talk to you this week about things that you need to know regarding safety, procedures, COVID-19, and you. So this week is going to be a series of videos about the virus, the protocols, and what you need to know. Let's start with a quick summary of the safety protocols. Number one, monitor yourself and your environment for illness. That means making sure that you're not sick and the people around you aren't sick. Number two, wear a mask and wear it the right way. Number three, stay distant. And number four, stay clean. Let's review some biology, starting with the cell. The cell is the basic unit of life. Living things are composed of cells. Your body is made of cells. Each cell is made out of a lipid membrane for the cell membrane as the outer protective layer. Inside the cell, you have special structures that help the cell function and carry out its processes. One of those structures is the nucleus, which stores and protects the DNA for your entire body. Now, DNA is the code of life. DNA contains the instructions telling your cell how to do things, what to do, when to do them, when to stop doing them. DNA is a nucleic acid, but there are other types of nucleic acids that also code for things. mRNA is messenger RNA, messenger ribonucleic acid. This is used for coding for proteins. Ribosomes are organelles in the cell that read this mRNA and put together the proteins. Those proteins are later used as building blocks, building things inside the cell. Most of the time, ribosomes get those mRNA instructions from the nucleus. This is all background that's very important to learn about if we're going to understand about viruses and vaccines. A virus is something that causes an infection and sometimes causes a disease. There are viruses that infect every living thing from plants to animals to bacteria. A bacteria could cause an infection too, but a bacteria is very clearly an organism that's living on its own, that's able to do its own life cycle and do things that living things do. Eat, drink, reproduce. A virus is very much smaller than a cell, very much smaller than a bacteria. A virus cannot reproduce on its own. A virus could be about 100 nanometers wide. Your skin cells are about 30,000 nanometers wide. That means if a cell was the size of a 10-foot tall room, the virus would just be about the width of your little finger's fingernail. Another comparison, a drop of water in a mist, airborne droplets, not a gas, but a condensed droplet of water that's still floating in the air. Those vary in size, but they could be about 1,000 nanometers wide. That drop of water is still 10 times the size of a virus. A virus really doesn't have very much to it. It's pretty much just a strand of DNA that's wrapped inside a candy shell. This outside shell is made out of proteins. Proteins wrapped around DNA. That's really all a virus is. Because the virus doesn't have a lot of the organelles and other cell parts that you and I have, it needs to get itself into the cell of a living organism to carry out its life cycle. Once it gets into the cell of the living organism, it's going to use those machine parts to make itself reproduce, make more of itself, and then the cycle repeats. It reproduces, it spreads out to other organisms, to other cells, and then it makes more of itself, and so on and so on. A virus would not be very successful if it infected one organism, killed that organism, and that would be the end of the story. That would also be the end of the virus. So for the virus to be successful, it needs to infect an organism, produce more viruses, and then those viruses have to spread out to other cells in other organisms. A successful virus is going to multiply and spread out by hanging out in water droplets from the inside of the organism that's infected. When you cough, you send out a spray of water particles. Those droplets go out into the air, and each droplet is really tiny. tiny, but if you remember, the size of the virus is even much more tiny. So it's going to carry many viruses inside each one of those water droplets. And each time you sneeze or cough, you're sending out more than just one virus in each one of those water droplets. It's not just coughing, it's sneezing, it's singing, it's shouting, it's talking, it's even breathing. All of these activities send out moisture from your body into the air that could contain viruses in the water droplets. These droplets can end up in another person in their wet places. The places that they get infected is through their eyes, their nose, or their mouth. These are the wet mucous membranes, the areas where the contact with the blood vessels is actually really shallow. It's a quick route from the outside air directly to the blood vessels. Is a virus alive? Well, it's a really good question and it deserves a really good argument. It's definitely not alive in the same way that I am. It's not alive in the same way that this plant is or my cat is. It relies on another organism in order to do most of the things that it needs to do, and really all it needs to do is reproduce. If you leave it alone and it never comes in contact with another living organism, it won't live, it won't die, it'll just be there as a bunch of molecules clustered together. Weird, right? Once the virus gets inside the cell, it uses the machinery of the cell to make new copies of itself, new versions of its DNA. Once the virus gets inside the cell, it uses the cell's machinery to make new copies of its DNA. It's trying to make new copies of itself. We haven't talked a lot about copying DNA, but when DNA gets copied, mistakes are made all the time. We call these mistakes mutations. A mutation could be as simple as mixing up two letters of code. They could be inserting extra copies of parts of the code, or it could be leaving out sections of code. Mutations in DNA are usually not a bad thing. Our cells are smart enough to figure out where the problems are and either ignore them or fix them. If a part of the code is scrambled that it doesn't make any sense, it just doesn't get used. Anytime an organism reproduces, it's making copies of its DNA. It's making copies of its DNA, and those copies have mutations in them. The more times an organism has reproduced over many generations, there are more and more mutations that make this ancestor different from this descendant. Every once in a while, one of these mutations gives an organism an evolutionary development that makes it better able to survive in its environment. It doesn't have to be some crazy mutation like extra eyes on the back of your head. It could be as simple as a polar bear, that this generation of polar bear has less fat storage, which makes it easier to survive in a warmer climate. That would be an advantage as the climate starts to change. That polar bear would be better able to survive. The longer something has been spreading around, the more mutations it can have. You have more mutations in you from your great-grandparents than you have from your parents. The further back you go, the more different your DNA is from them. A virus that spreads around slowly has very few mutations, so it doesn't change much from year to year. A virus that spreads rapidly and is reproducing very much along the way over many months has many opportunities to have those mutations and to make different versions of itself. That's enough for today, guys. We're going to talk more about this later this week. Have a good day, stay safe, stay healthy.